Trump administration official telling CNN a draft White House memo suggests furloughed employees may not be entitled to back pay for the time they were told not to work during the shutdown. CNN's Elena Treen is at the White House along with Paula.
The lights inside the White House were still on long after midnight, and that alone told you something was wrong. Staffers moved quietly through the West Wing, phones pressed to their ears, voices low, faces tight with the kind of tension that doesn't come from a normal political fight, but from uncertainty about what happens next. Subscribe to our channel Reports on States for verified in-depth political reporting. Earlier that day, CNN reported that a draft White House memo was circulating internally during a government shutdown, raising a legally explosive question whether furloughed federal employees would actually be entitled to back pay for the days they were ordered not to work. On its face, it sounded technical. In reality, it struck at the core of how executive power interacts with federal labor law. Under the Back Pay Act of 1966, Congress has historically stepped in after shutdowns to guarantee retroactive pay. In fact, after the 35-day shutdown of 2018-2019, lawmakers passed legislation explicitly authorizing back pay for furloughed workers. That precedent matters because it defines where presidential discretion ends and congressional authority begins. What made this draft memo alarming to legal observers was not that it had been finalized, it hadn't, but that it suggested a willingness inside the executive branch to test those boundaries. Federal unions immediately warned that denying back pay would almost certainly trigger lawsuits in the Court of Federal Claims, where past cases have consistently ruled that once Congress authorizes retroactive pay, agencies must comply. In other words, this wasn't just about money. It was about whether the administration was prepared to provoke a constitutional and legal fight at a moment when political pressure was already intensifying. At the same time, the political atmosphere around the president was growing increasingly volatile. According to public statements and open letters reported across major outlets, a growing number of House members, Democrats and Republicans alike, were signaling that the accumulation of scandals, investigations, and courtroom confrontations had become unsustainable. These were not impeachment votes yet. They were warnings. Lawmakers invoking language like constitutional duty and institutional stability were sending a message that concern was no longer confined to partisan opponents. Inside Washington, the word resignation carries enormous weight. It is not used casually because it implies that ordinary checks, oversight hearings, subpoenas, elections may no longer be enough. When members of the president's own party begin to discuss it publicly, it reflects fear not just of political fallout, but of systemic damage, court orders ignored, legal norms strained, and public trust eroding. What tied the shutdown memo and the political unrest together was a single theme: control. Who ultimately decides what happens when the law, the courts, and the presidency collide? The memo suggested a hardline executive approach to federal workers. The growing chorus on Capitol Hill suggested lawmakers were preparing for a confrontation of their own, one rooted in constitutional mechanisms rather than policy disputes. By nightfall, senior aides understood the danger. Every new legal fight added another layer of scrutiny. Every angry public response hardened opposition. And every institutional norm pushed to its limit made it easier for critics to argue that the system itself was under threat. This was no longer about one decision or one memo. It was about whether the presidency could absorb another shock without something breaking. By the next morning, the focus shifted from internal memos to public pressure. Statements that had once been whispered to reporters were now being read aloud at microphones. Lawmakers spoke carefully, often choosing words like concern, duty, and constitutional responsibility. But the meaning was unmistakable. When elected officials begin to publicly question whether a president should continue in office, it signals that normal political disagreement has crossed into institutional alarm. To understand why this matters, it's important to separate what is confirmed from what is alleged. Calls for resignation, by themselves, have no legal force. The Constitution does not recognize pressure campaigns as a removal mechanism, but historically, they have mattered. Richard Nixon's decision to resign in 1974 followed weeks of escalating signals from Congress that impeachment votes were inevitable. Lawmakers weren't removing him yet, but they were clearly preparing the ground. That historical memory is never far from the minds of seasoned members of Congress. Behind the scenes, legal teams were also doing their own math. Impeachment is a two-step process. The House votes on articles of impeachment by a simple majority, and the Senate then holds a trial where removal requires a two-thirds vote. That threshold is intentionally high. It exists to ensure that removal only happens when misconduct is so serious that it commands broad agreement across party lines. Because of that, resignation is often viewed as an off-ramp, a way to avoid months of hearings, subpoenas, and testimony that could paralyze the government. What raised eyebrows this time was the scope of the concerns being cited. Lawmakers pointed not to a single policy dispute, but to a pattern: repeated clashes with courts, open defiance of legal orders, and rhetoric that framed judges and prosecutors as enemies rather than independent actors. Legal scholars frequently note that the American system depends less on force and more on compliance. Courts do not command armies. They rely on the executive branch to respect and enforce rulings. When that respect erodes, the entire structure starts to wobble. At the same time, discussions about the 25th Amendment began appearing in serious reporting, not as gossip, but as analysis. Ratified in 1967, the amendment was designed to address presidential incapacity, not political disagreement. Section 4 allows the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to declare that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. If invoked, the vice president becomes acting president immediately, though the president can contest the declaration, triggering a vote in Congress that requires a two-thirds majority in both chambers to keep the transfer of power in place. The mere fact that commentators and former officials were explaining this process on major networks underscored how unusual the moment had become. Historically, Section 4 has never been fully invoked. It exists as a safeguard of last resort. Talking about it openly is a sign that trust within the executive branch itself may be under strain, or at least that observers believe it could be. Meanwhile, the legal calendar kept moving. Court deadlines do not pause for political crises. Motions are filed. Hearings are scheduled. Judges issue orders. Each step creates another moment where compliance, or defiance, can escalate tensions. For lawmakers already worried about institutional stability, this convergence of legal pressure and political volatility was deeply unsettling. By the end of the day, Washington felt like it was holding its breath. The administration insisted it was business as usual. Critics argued that nothing about the moment was normal, and in between those positions sat the Constitution itself, designed for moments of stress, now being tested by a combination of law, politics, and raw human reaction. As pressure mounted, attention shifted from rhetoric to documentation. In Washington, words matter, but paper matters more. Committees quietly requested records, legal teams reviewed filings line by line, and constitutional scholars began appearing more frequently in closed-door briefings. The question everyone was asking was no longer emotional or ideological. It was procedural. What evidence exists, and where does it lead? At the center of these conversations was the distinction between political scandal and legally actionable misconduct. History draws a sharp line between the two. Presidents have survived unpopular wars, disastrous policies, and even personal misconduct when it failed to cross legal thresholds. What changes the equation is evidence of obstruction, abuse of power, or defiance of lawful authority. Those are not subjective judgments. They are standards developed through statutes, court precedent, and constitutional interpretation. Lawmakers reviewing potential impeachment pathways focused heavily on process. An impeachment inquiry is not a criminal trial. It does not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, it asks whether alleged conduct rises to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, a phrase deliberately left broad by the framers. James Madison argued during the Constitutional Convention that impeachment was necessary for abuses that injured the state itself, even if they did not fit neatly into criminal codes. That historical context still guides modern interpretation. What made the situation especially volatile was the accumulation of parallel legal pressures. Civil cases, criminal investigations, and congressional oversight were all unfolding at once. Each arena has its own rules, timelines, and standards of proof, but they interact in powerful ways. Testimony in one case can affect another. A ruling in civil court can influence congressional perception, and public reactions can shape political will, even if they don't determine legal outcomes. Inside congressional offices, staffers began mapping scenarios. If articles of impeachment were introduced, how quickly could hearings begin? What witnesses would be called? How would classified information be handled? These are not theoretical exercises. The House has detailed rules governing impeachment proceedings, refined through previous cases. Committees must vote to advance articles. The full House debates and votes. Only then does the matter move to the Senate, where the Chief Justice presides and senators act as jurors. At the same time, the administration's responses were being closely scrutinized. Public statements attacking judges or prosecutors may rally supporters, but they can also become exhibits in oversight inquiries. Legal experts often warn that such rhetoric risks undermining claims of respect for the rule of law. In previous cases, courts have cited public statements when evaluating intent, especially in disputes involving compliance with orders or the limits of executive authority. The broader political consequences were also coming into focus. Approval ratings, while not legally binding, influence how aggressively lawmakers act. When support erodes, especially within a president's own party, the cost of inaction rises. Representatives facing competitive elections must calculate whether defending the president helps or harms their chances. History shows that once those calculations tip, momentum can shift rapidly. By this point, the story was no longer about one memo, one shutdown, or one confrontation. It was about convergence. Legal timelines were tightening, political patience was thinning, and institutional mechanisms, impeachment, oversight, constitutional safeguards, were no longer abstract concepts discussed in textbooks. They were active options being weighed by people with the authority to use them. The sense inside Washington was unmistakable. The system was entering a decisive phase. What happened next would depend not just on personalities, but on whether institutions held firm under pressure or whether the strain forced outcomes that few had imagined only months earlier. As institutions braced for what could come next, the legal dimension of the crisis moved from background noise to center stage. Courts do not operate on political calendars, and that reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Judges issued deadlines, attorneys filed motions. Each filing carried consequences because compliance with court orders is not optional, even for the executive branch. Under Article 2, the president executes the law, but Article 3 gives courts the authority to interpret it. That balance only works when both sides accept the limits of their power. Legal analysts began focusing on a core issue: enforcement. If a court issues a lawful order and the executive branch resists, the remedy is not theoretical. Courts can impose sanctions, hold parties in contempt, and in extreme cases, refer matters for further enforcement. Historically, presidents have avoided direct defiance of courts precisely because the system lacks a clean resolution once that line is crossed. Andrew Jackson's infamous refusal to enforce Worcester versus Georgia in 1832 is often cited as a cautionary tale of what happens when institutional respect collapses. Congressional oversight intersects directly with this question. When lawmakers investigate potential obstruction or abuse of power, they look for patterns: missed deadlines, ignored subpoenas, retaliatory actions against witnesses, or public statements designed to intimidate legal actors. None of these, by themselves, automatically trigger removal, but together they can form the basis for claims that the executive is undermining constitutional order. This is where the distinction between politics and law becomes especially important for the public to understand. Impeachment is not punishment. It is a safeguard. The framers designed it as a way to protect the republic from officials who misuse authority, not as a substitute for criminal courts. That's why impeachment can proceed even while criminal cases are unresolved, and why the standards differ. Congress asks whether conduct is compatible with holding office, not whether it meets the elements of a crime. Inside the administration, the pressure was no less intense. Senior officials understood that every decision would be scrutinized not just for legality, but for intent. Internal communications, if later requested by investigators, could reveal whether actions were taken in good faith or as part of a broader strategy to resist oversight. That awareness tends to produce caution, but it can also create paralysis, slowing decision-making at precisely the moment clarity is needed. International observers were also paying attention. Stability in the U.S. presidency is not just a domestic concern. Allies and adversaries alike watch for signs of institutional strain because uncertainty affects diplomacy, markets, and security commitments. Political scientists often note that constitutional crises rarely announce themselves loudly at first. They emerge through accumulation. One ignored norm, one stretched power, one unresolved conflict at a time. By the end of this phase, the narrative had shifted again. The question was no longer whether controversy existed. That was undeniable. The question was whether existing mechanisms could resolve it without causing deeper damage. Could courts enforce their rulings? Could Congress exercise oversight without triggering chaos? Could the executive recalibrate before crossing irreversible lines? Those questions were no longer academic. They were shaping decisions in real time, and the answers would determine not just the fate of one presidency, but how resilient the system itself truly was. By this stage, the crisis had taken on a different character. It was no longer driven by single headlines or isolated confrontations, but by accumulation. In constitutional systems, accumulation is dangerous because it narrows options. Each unresolved conflict limits the room for compromise in the next one. Lawmakers, judges, and executive officials all understood that reality, and it was shaping their behavior in subtle but important ways. On Capitol Hill, conversations increasingly centered on timing. Oversight does not happen in a vacuum. Committees must decide when to act, not just how. Move too quickly, and the process can look rushed or partisan. Move too slowly, and critics argue that Congress failed to act when warning signs were clear. Historically, the most consequential investigations, Watergate being the clearest example, advanced deliberately, building a public record step by step. Transcripts, sworn testimony, and documented timelines mattered more than dramatic moments. That methodical approach serves a purpose. Impeachment, if it occurs, must be defensible not just politically, but historically. Members of Congress know that their votes will be studied for decades. For that reason, many focus less on media pressure and more on whether evidentiary thresholds are being met. Are there documented instances of non-compliance? Are there clear explanations for executive actions, or are justifications shifting over time? Consistency in legal analysis often matters as much as intent. Within the executive branch, the strain was increasingly visible through procedural signals. Delays in responding to congressional requests, narrowly worded public statements, and careful parsing of language all suggested a heightened awareness of legal exposure. Former officials often describe this phase as one of internal caution, where decisions are filtered through layers of legal review to avoid creating records that could later be scrutinized. While that may reduce risk in the short term, it can also slow governance at a moment when decisive action is expected. Public opinion, meanwhile, continued to exert quiet pressure. Polling does not remove presidents from office, but it influences the calculations of those who can. Political scientists note that when approval ratings drop below certain thresholds, especially among a president's own party, support in Congress becomes fragile. Members begin to ask whether defending the president aligns with their duty to constituents, or whether distance is the safer course. That calculation is rarely announced openly, but it often explains sudden shifts in tone. What made this moment particularly unstable was the convergence of legal review and political accountability. Courts assess compliance with law. Congress assesses fitness for office. Voters assess trust. Each operates independently, but their judgments can reinforce one another. A negative court ruling can embolden lawmakers. Congressional action can shape public perception. Public reaction can, in turn, affect institutional confidence. By now, few in Washington believed the situation would simply fade. Even those urging restraint acknowledged that the system was approaching a decision point. Either mechanisms of accountability would be activated, or the presidency would have to recalibrate in a way that restored confidence across branches of government. The cost of inaction was becoming clearer with each passing day. As one veteran constitutional scholar put it in a closed briefing, moments like this test not just leaders, but structures. The question is not whether conflict exists, that is inevitable in a democracy, but whether the rules designed to manage conflict still command respect when pressure is highest. By the time the situation reached its final phase, the atmosphere in Washington had shifted from speculation to reckoning. The constant motion of the Capitol, hearings, filings, briefings, continued as always, but beneath it was a shared understanding that the presidency was at an inflection point. Institutions had been tested simultaneously, and their responses were now shaping the outcome in ways that could not be easily reversed. What ultimately matters in moments like this is not how loud the debate becomes, but how clearly authority is exercised. Congress possesses the constitutional power to investigate and, if necessary, impeach. The courts possess the authority to interpret the law and compel compliance. The executive possesses the duty to execute the law faithfully. When all three act within their defined roles, the system holds. When one resists the others, tension escalates. Legal experts emphasize that none of the available paths, resignation, impeachment, or constitutional transfer of power, are designed to humiliate. They exist to protect continuity and legitimacy. Resignation is voluntary and political. Impeachment is deliberative and legislative. The 25th Amendment is procedural and medical or functional in nature. Each option reflects a different diagnosis of the same problem, whether the presidency can continue to function without destabilizing the republic. For lawmakers weighing their next moves, the stakes extended far beyond party loyalty. Their decisions would signal to future presidents how far executive power can stretch before consequences follow. They would also shape public trust in institutions already under strain. History has shown that when accountability mechanisms fail, cynicism fills the gap. When they function, even painfully, they reinforce democratic resilience. Internationally, the message was equally important. Allies looked to the United States not for perfection, but for predictability and adherence to law. Adversaries look for weakness and division. How the crisis was resolved would influence diplomatic credibility, market confidence, and perceptions of stability for years to come. Constitutional order is not just a domestic concern, it is a strategic asset. As the dust began to settle, one truth stood out. Crises rarely end with a single dramatic moment. More often, they conclude through a series of decisions, some quiet, some public, that collectively determine direction. Whether through recalibration, accountability, or transition, the outcome would be recorded not just in headlines, but in history books. For viewers watching this unfold, understanding the process matters as much as following the drama. Democracy is not self-executing. It relies on informed citizens, independent institutions, and leaders willing to respect limits. Moments like this reveal both the fragility and the strength of that design. Thank you for watching and staying informed. For continued fact-based, in-depth coverage of major political developments, stay connected with Reports on States.